Good afternoon. We're just letting more people join in from the waiting room. Please keep your microphone audio on mute, which should be at the bottom left corner of your screen, and set your screen view, which should be in the top right corner, to speaker view. Please feel free to keep your video on. My name is Michael Gately. I'm the Executive Director of Biographers International Organization. Bio aims to promote the art and craft of biography and provide educational and fellowship opportunities that support the work of biographers worldwide. It's great to see so many Bio members join us for today's workshop on coaching. If you're not yet a member, please join us. You'll find a link to our website, biographersinternational.org, in the chat. Please also join us on Monday, November 9th at 7 p.m. Eastern Time as Bio presents its Editorial Excellence Award to Gayatri Patnaik, Associate Director and Editorial Director of Beacon Press, where for 18 years she's edited and published many books on race, ethnicity, and immigration. She'll be joined by three of her authors, Imani Perry, Marcus Rediker, and Jean Theo Harris, and the literary agent Tanya McKinnon, for a conversation on editing biographies. I'll share a registration link to this free event, again on November 9th, also in the chat box. During today's coaching event, please write any questions you have in the chat, and we'll try to save some time for them near the end of the conversation. It's my pleasure now to turn to Anne Boyd-Rioux, Coordinator of Bio's coaching program and host of this workshop, to introduce the panelists.
Hi, everybody. I'm Anne Boyd-Rioux, and I'm a member of the Executive Board of Bio, and I'm chairing a committee now on these Zoom workshops that we're doing and the Zoom roundtables that some of you are in as well. Steve Paul and Marlene Tressman, other board members, are also on this committee with me. If you have suggestions for future topics, I would encourage you to send them to me. And the topic for this session actually came from our last presentation that we had. We had a panel of agents who had a lot of great information to give us. And in the chat, somebody had suggested this as a topic, which I thought was a great idea. So Bio has a coaching program for members. And those of us, I'm a coach, and Carol Sklenicka and Carl Rollyson are currently coaches. Kate has coached at the conferences before, but there's a whole list of coaches on there for biographers who need a little bit of assistance or some help or some guidance. We will be doing another coaches panel for our next panel in November. Time and date to be determined. That panel of coaches will talk about proposals and promoting your biography. The topic for today is research and writing. And I had 13 questions come in to me before this meeting, which means that we may not have time for additional questions that you put in the chat, but maybe there's a follow-up or something, a quick question that might come up in the chat. I'll try to keep an eye on that as we go along here. I'm not sure if Michael mentioned this, but you can put your Zoom on speaker view up in the right-hand corner. That way you will see just whoever's talking at the time and not, the whole screen of people if you would prefer that. So we have three wonderful coaches and biographers with us today. I won't say a lot about them since their bios were on the registration page. Kate Buford is a biographer of Jim Thorpe and Burt Lancaster. She's also a founding member of Biography by Design. Carl Rollyson has written many biographies, the latest of which is on William Faulkner. He's also written 3 books about biography and has a podcast called A Life in Biography that I would recommend to all of you. Carol Sklenicka is the biographer of Raymond Carver and Alice Adams, and she's received fellowships from Yaddo, Harry Ransom Center, and other places. So we're very happy to have the 3 of you with us today. So I'll go ahead and launch into the questions here. The first one is on research. How do successful biographers save and organize the enormous amount of information that they collect when they're researching, primary sources, notes. I'd love to hear about various systems tips for keeping everything straight. Carol, do you want to start answering that one?
Sure. I'm one of the most important things I learned at my first biography conference long ago was to make a chronology. And that seems so elementary, but when I was first starting, I really didn't know that. And I've now expanded the idea of chronology to be just a record keeping system so that I make notes to myself within my timeline of where everything is. And I have boxes and boxes of papers, and then I have more and more digital things as the years go on. I don't want to be the only one to answer this question because I think everybody has to find their own system. I've been hearing great things about Scrivener from someone I was coaching, so I hope there's somebody here that's using one of those programs. I'm certainly going to do it when I write another biography. Scrivener is a program that allows you to attach files to each other in a complicated way, which is what you have to do for a biography. Can I pass it on to the next?
Yeah, so Kate and Carl, have either of you used Scrivener?
I haven't.
Okay.
No,
Well,
I haven't either, but I've heard good things about it.
I was using it until I started noticing I was doing a lot of clipping. So, you know, kind of like a screenshot, you can use a clip and save on your, or snip and save, maybe it's called, on your computer to, you know, grab a little piece of something online and pop it in. I pop it into Scrivener and then I started noticing that those pieces were disappearing. They weren't showing up. They weren't pasting in properly. So I stopped using Scrivener. It might just be a glitch with my system, but I'm back to using Word and Google Docs. But Kate and Carl, do you have any suggestions for organizing all of your research? Any tips you want to share?
Well, I love paper. And so once a proposal is accepted, what I've done is set up paper files. I already know what the different chapters are going to have in them. I already know what the different subsets are. So it's really pretty old fashioned, but it's a tabbed file with the name of whatever subject it is within that chapter. And it's organized by, let's say a book has 3 parts, part 1, part 2, part 3, different colors for each part on the file folders. And then I set them up to reflect what is going to go into those folders. And then as I go through the research, I throw everything into those file folders. So then when I start out to write, there are some Google Doc materials, there are some things online, but it always gets copied eventually so that I have paper and can spread that all out. I'm more comfortable with paper.
There are 2 things. I could put these in the chat later. Blake Bailey, the biographer of Richard Yates and John Cheever and forthcoming Philip Roth, wrote a great essay about how to use your chronology for organizing. It was on Salon or someplace like that. I can't remember. I'll have to look it up. And then there was a book I got early on. It's a book about biography called Life into Art, edited by Gail Porter Mandel. And in there is an essay by a woman named Elizabeth Young Bruhl, biographer of Hannah Arendt, earlier biography of Hannah Arendt. And she talks about her filing system in great detail. And that essay helped me with paper files, because like Kate, I'm still more comfortable with paper files. If something's important, you know, like I take a photograph of something at a place like the Ransom Center that lets you photograph documents, I often end up printing that photograph on paper or, you know, that document on paper so that I can still shuffle it around. So I don't know, I'd love to be all digital. It would be more convenient, but
Right.
I just can't quite manage it.
Well, I have to say, yeah, my last book and my new book they're becoming more and more digital as I move along. But Michael, maybe you could look up that essay, that Blake Bailey essay on using a chronology for us and pop that in the chat. That would be cool. So another question that came up was, which is also, I think, very appropriate to start with, is somebody was wondering about some of that front matter that you see in books. Can you differentiate between a preface, introduction, and a foreword, and when should they be used? Kate, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, certainly. For me, there's not much difference between a preface and a foreword. And if there is a difference, somebody else can chime in. I've seen both terms used interchangeably. Often an introduction, again, you can look through different biographies to see what they're doing. An introduction can be after a foreword or preface and be a kind of in media res, jumping into the narrative before you get onto chapter 1. What's really more important about what it does. They should set out, without giving away, I have my notes here, without giving away too much of the story, the biographer's approach and intent. It should be a bit of a teaser in a way. You shouldn't give away too much in the preface, as my editor Knopf says. Otherwise, why would someone continue to read it? For example, there's a new bio of Lincoln out now called Abe by David Reynolds, big new fat biography. And he states in his preface, and I think this is a good example, and he calls it a preface, that to date, there has been no full-scale cultural biography which alone can capture Lincoln in his historical fullness, which he means by that the economic and social history of Lincoln. Now, whether this is true and whether he rises to that challenge, we will see from people who read it and interviewers. But it was a very clear setting out in his preface about what he is going to do and what he hopes to accomplish with the book. So it's a kind of an art form, that first preface and forward. You have to give an overall sense of what the book is going to do and how you're going to do it without giving too much away.
We had a follow-up question here. What about a prologue?
Gosh, same thing, I think. I mean, others can chime in and say if there's some kind of interesting difference between all these. I don't see a difference myself.
For me, I've only written one prologue, I think, of all the biographies I've written. And that was my first biography of Martha Gellhorn. And I treated the prologue like sort of a prologue in a drama because it was an unauthorized biography. And because she was alive, I wanted to introduce the reader, familiarize the reader in a sense with that idea, with the biographer, in this case, me, in Gellhorn country, approaching her house, not knowing if she's home, whether she'll run me off the property or what she'll do. So it seemed to me like a preface wouldn't be the right word for that, that it was a kind of, prologue, the story behind the story or the story before the story. And that seemed a good way to do it. So I think it depends a lot on the kind of book you're writing.
But I would think an introduction might be for a somewhat more scholarly book. You might see an introduction that might be more about the book and why it's important and how it was written. Prologue would be more the beginning of the story, drawing the reader into the story, maybe. Kind of how I thought of them.
Could be.
Okay. Anything else? Okay. So the next question is about footnotes, endnotes, those lovely references that we need to keep track of while we're doing our work. What is the minimum amount of references one can do and still ensure the book has credibility? This person finds reference notations within a text distracting. So, she ends up jumping back and forth between the main story and as the author probably intended it to be read. Is it okay to just have a bibliography or list of references at the end of the book? Carl, do you want to answer that one?
Okay, I've done all kinds of versions of notes and endnotes and various ways. It depends, again, on the kind of biography I'm writing. In my last biography, The Life of William Faulkner, I had, it's 2 volumes and there are lots and lots and lots of notes. It was published by University of Virginia Press. And I actually proposed to them sort of streamlining the notes and doing what people sometimes call sort of portmanteau notes, where, you know, you get to the end of the paragraph and there are a whole, in the back of the book, there are a whole series of references and so on. They didn't want that. They wanted all those footnotes because they knew that although I was trying to write for the general reader for sure, there are an awful lot of Faulkner scholars who want to know very specifically where I got that piece of information if they're not familiar with it. And so I think, again, it depends partly on whether this biography you're writing has some real scholarly import. If it's for both scholars and general readers. I also have a book out this year, The Last Days of Sylvia Plath. If you turn to the back of that, what you'll see is kind of a story of my sources for each chapter, or each section. There really aren't chapters in the book, there's sections. For each section, I list the various references, if there are quotations in that section, if there are other scholars, biographers that I draw on, or primary sources. I'll tell you about those. And it's almost a kind of, and this wasn't mentioned, but it's almost a kind of annotated bibliography, where you're not just throwing out your sources, but you're not only telling the reader what the sources are, but you're giving your sense of the reliability of the sources, how perceptive the sources are that you've been using. People can do that in long footnotes as well at the back of the book. With my Sontag biography that I wrote with my wife, if you look at the back of that, some people complained about it. There were sources, you could find out where we got our information, but it was done almost as a kind of narrative again about sources. Some people love that kind of thing because it's not as dry or as academic or seemingly scholarly. And it sort of draws you into the story of the investigation itself, which I loved. And some reviewers really liked that, and others felt it wasn't specific enough. So it varies a lot from, I think, from project to project and book to book. Oh, also one other thing, publishers.
Yeah, I think an interesting thing about endnotes.
Go ahead,
Yeah.
Carl, why don't you finish?
I was
No,
just going to
finish.
say, some publishers have their requirements. You know, that they want those footnotes, or they want those endnotes, or they want, you know, the key phrase and a page number at the back of the book so readers can look it up, but they don't want footnotes distracting the reader in the text itself. So sometimes you're limited by what the publisher wants too.
Yeah, I was just going to add that I remember early on in writing biographies, someone told me if there's that piece of information that you can't bear to let go of, but it really shouldn't be in the narrative, put it in the endnote. So the endnotes become, if the endnotes are really good, they're almost like a counter narrative, or not counter, but supporting narrative. So they have a certain flow. So there's a richness to endnotes too. And also I think the typeface is smaller, so they can get more of them on fewer pages if they're trying to on paper and space. So endnote journey itself, I think. Put all your little nuggets in there that you just couldn't bear to part with.
Carol?
Yeah, I just wanted to add something I learned about procedure on my last book. My first of two biographies, the first one I had done endnotes with numbers in the text, and my editor wanted me to change them to blind notes, and it was extremely difficult. So on the second book, I prepared for both methods. I used the word processor with the in-text numbers to create endnotes, but I also put taglines on each note, which meaning a few words from my main text to lead off the note, so that it could easily be converted to what are called blind notes. And I assume everyone knows blind notes are when at the back of the book you just have the page number, you don't have an in-text number. So if you're a first-time biographer, you probably don't know what your publisher is going to want in this regard. So you really have to be prepared to go either way. And I think you have to keep track of everything. And then if you end up doing portmanteau notes, or maybe not even doing notes at all, doing some other kind of system as the question suggested, you've still got the information and you can condense it and manipulate it the way you want to. But it's a real nightmare if you haven't kept track of it, because it's
Right.
almost impossible to go back and You're going to have to research your book again if you don't keep track.
Right. I found myself doing that as well, just to keep track. And when when the book is done and you're doing those final edits, that's when you can, maybe take some out and put in IBID, right? Because you're using the same source a couple times in a row. But if you cut something out in between, while you're editing, you might lose what the IBID refers to, right? So you really have to every single endnote has to refer back to your source. And so where you found it, and you can sort that all out later with your editor, how they want to manage those endnotes.
I think it's helpful too, if you have a contract with a publisher and you're launching in, as Carol said, is to look, or even before that, to look at other books that publisher like yours, let's say biographies, look at how, I did that with Knopf, look at how their other books are sourced, because that will be what they require of you and what the format is. And that's really helpful. Then you know what they expect.
Okay. There was another question about how to track and manage endnotes, but I think we've already answered that, haven't we? I think we've already kind of gone over that. Did you have anything else to add to that, Carol?
I think there are some programs. No, I was just going to, I'm not Carol, I'm Kate, but I was going to say that I understand there are programs that keep track of your notes online if you want to do that. I did not do that. I probably will the next time, because it strikes me as really smart for the reasons that Anne just said. If they change, you can more easily go back. But there are some programs, and maybe someone else has used one of them.
As far as I know, the word processing program does fine with notes, but maybe there's something better.
Mm-hmm.
What I really like to
First,
do
keep
when I'm
all the
writing,
versions of your manuscript too.
Yeah.
So if you've cut something out, it might still be in an older version.
Right. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay, so there were a couple of questions about writing about a lesser known subject. So maybe they were well known in their time, but been forgotten, or they were involved in a rather minor historical moment. How do you make the subject relevant and interesting to a broader audience? And what types of personal nuggets should one seek, or what amount of historical background and stage setting would you develop? So I guess, yeah, there's kind of a couple questions there, but Kate, do you want to take a stab at that one?
Sure, that's a great question, and certainly a timely one, since we're discovering all kinds of subjects. I would say you have to ask yourself, why was this person well known in his or her own time? And you have to find the passion at that time for this person. What made them notable in their time? One kind of maybe extreme example is the book Seabiscuit, about a horse. Seabiscuit had been long forgotten, but if you go back into the late 1930s, Seabiscuit was a passion.
Mm-hmm.
Why? And if you tap into that temper of the times, and why that people gravitated to a horse and what that horse meant to them. And of course, the book is, as we all know, enormously successful and very well done. Agents and publishers will want to know how this person's life resonates now. It's a common question. Okay, you find some wonderfully undiscovered person or overlooked person. Well, how is that important now in 2020? That this whole kind of hidden figures trope, especially important now, and increased attention being paid to women and persons of color or other people previously not examined enough. Part of the question, I think, was historical background is extremely important. You're telling a story, just like the Seabiscuit example. You have to go back in time. There's an element of time travel. You need to create a place, a time in history in which, and that's part of the excitement of it for all of us who are biographers, is to go back in time. For example, this lesser known subject idea, 2 biographies of mine on Burt Lancaster in the movies and Jim Thorpe in sports. These were people who were sort of well known, had been well known, and they were also figures, and this is important, of popular culture, so-called popular culture, which means that movies and sports, that kind of topic, can be easily dismissed. I chose these subjects because they were really key, important influences on their respective sectors and had been overlooked. So when you look at a lesser known subject, you have to think of several layers, I think. I mean, are they, like in Carl's case, although he's written about famous people, are they literary people, or Alice Adams? Are they people in sectors of our life that are considered sort of frivolous, like sports or movies, but are really not? They are who we are, our culture. So you have to make a case for why they need to be looked at now and again. So that's my take on that. There are lots of different aspects of that, but I think it's a timely moment in biography to be writing about lesser known subjects. You just have to make your case that much stronger.
I love the Seabiscuit example, Kate. That's one I've never thought of for this category, because I mean, we might sort of forget that Seabiscuit wasn't as well known when she published that book, because now we all know Seabiscuit, but that's what her book did. So it'd be a great example to go back and look. And there are lots of others, lots of other books that also kind of resurrected these unknown people and have made them so relevant. One that I just thought of was Eric Larson's In the Garden of Beasts. He's writing about an ambassador to Germany that nobody really knows who that was, but it was the times that he illuminated, right, that became so important. Carl and Carol, did you want to add anything to this question about lesser known subjects?
They did a great job. I was going to mention a book that I think kind of started the trend toward looking at lesser lives, and the book is called Lesser Lives by Diane Johnson, the novelist. And let's see, it has a subtitle, Lesser Lives, the First Mrs. Meredith. I think there's more to it than that. The True History of the First Mrs. Meredith and Other Lesser Lives by Diane Johnson, which was her dissertation at UCLA in the early 70s. And, you know, ended up being a trade book and led her to, she also wrote a biography of Dashiell Hammett and then became a great novelist. But she just thought, oh, who is this missing person in the life of George Meredith, and began to look into that.
The other thing that occurs to me is if I were doing a let's say even not even lesser known, but in a way obscure or not really appreciated figure, is it may be a story of discovery. How you found out about this person might become an essential part of the story. Might be a way of really getting the reader excited about, you know, how did you happen on this? You know, letters in a trunk in an attic or whatever it is. People seem to really love those kinds of stories.
The Quest for Corvo.
Yeah, exactly.
That the letters in the attic makes me think, well, of course, Hidden Figures is a great example of this too, of discovering people. People are hiding in plain sight all over the place. And it's like that picture in the attic that everybody never bothered to look at. I'm not behind one of these anyway, but you, the picture in the attic, nobody paid much attention to, and then somebody goes up and says, that's a Picasso. You know, it's like, nobody looked at it clearly, nobody looked at it carefully. And boy, there are so many subjects out there, and it's our job to make them exciting and applicable.
I'm wondering, something I thought a lot about, and I'll just kind of throw this in there. Is there something about the biography, right? The idea of a biography, telling a person's entire life, that seems to skew more towards people we already know, towards people who are famous, right? So if you're writing about a lesser known person, maybe you don't call it a biography, or maybe you don't write their entire life. You tell part of the story that you think is particularly illuminating or interesting. And maybe there's lots of backstory that you can bring in, and you can have an epilogue that sort of casts forward. What do you all think about that?
Yeah, I thought of doing that. There's somebody I knew, he was not famous at all. He was just a city official in Detroit when I was living in Detroit. And he lived in the same apartment building. And he was just full of, he was in his 70s then, of the history of the city. And I mean, his stories of working for city government and what Detroit was like and when it had streetcars. And so, I mean, the whole thing, it's still, it's still with me. I can imagine doing that. I haven't yet, but it's something I can imagine doing. He was a widower. Part of the story was about his love for his wife. He had done something that I'd never done. He had kept every theater program, every restaurant menu. I mean, that just fascinated me. He would talk about going to his wife's grave and what that was like. And my wife and I would just listen enraptured. And then he would look at us and he'd say, my family is tired of these stories. But I thought there was just a, wonderful insight into, a life that was not, in a sense, distinguished or famous at all. And yet said so much about being a human being and about a particular place and a particular time.
There's a follow-up here too in the chat about books that touch on the lives of several individuals who have something in common. So maybe the individuals themselves weren't famous, but, so that would be kind of a group biography. That might be another way to approach it. Do you have any thoughts about that?
Well, that's the hidden figures syndrome, there they are. I mean, they were so important and they had, for many reasons we all know now, had been overlooked, but that's a group biography. Yeah, and their time had come. I think also to answer your earlier question, I think the full treatment, it depends on the subject. Again, if this person really had an impact on his or her sector from birth to death, and you need to tell the whole story, then the whole story needs to be told. But if it's one little slice of a life that really made a huge impact, then your point is really good, that you would focus on that and do the before and after in a truncated version, but focus on that one illuminating time in that person's life.
Okay, that sounds great. So let's move on to the next question, which is about when a biographer knows the subject that they are writing about. What advice do you have about whether they should make themselves a part of the biography? And if so, how should they do it? And if not, why not? Carl, do you want to take that one?
I'll say a little bit about one book I wrote, which is the title is A Private Life of Michael Foote, former leader of the Labor Party, but also quite a literary man, wrote about Byron, wrote about Jonathan Swift. And I got to know him when I was doing my biography of Rebecca West. And then his wife, when his wife died, I knew his wife too, and she was a filmmaker and a documentarian. I was very interested in her as well. I wrote about both of them, but my biography of his wife is pretty much a conventional biography. I don't put myself into it, even though I knew her. But as I was doing that biography, one of the major sources was her husband, Michael Foote. And I recorded everything with him because he was such a wonderful phrase maker, for one thing. And it just seemed so important to get his exact words down. And when I finished the biography of Joe Craigie, I had over, I think, 100 hours of him talking, and probably another 100 of other people talking about him and friends of him and of his wife. And I thought, I'm going to write a book, but it's not going to be a conventional biography. It's really about how I came to know him. And it's going to be like Boswell, in the sense that if you look at Boswell's Life with Johnson, it's really a series of conversations strung together by a narrative. And so that's what I did. I felt perfectly comfortable putting myself in the book because he was commenting on me. I was commenting on him. We were getting to know each other. He was kind of cagey about certain things about his past and his marriage and so on. And that became almost comical in some ways, as well as dramatic. And so that seemed perfect. Other times, this is getting a little off the subject, but the question about putting yourself in the book, how do you do that, whether you know the subject or not? Sometimes in a few of my biographies, I've done that. And the way I do it is I'll take an excerpt from an interview and I'll do it like a drama. I'll put my initials and I'll put the interviewee's initials. And I'll just do a little bit of that to give the reader, again, the flavor of how this material was acquired, sort of the tone and the context of the circumstances. I don't know if other panelists have had this kind of experience with a living figure or not. The other living figures I've dealt with don't want to have anything to do with me, so that's a different story.
One recent example is Megan Marshall's biography of Elizabeth Bishop.
Yes.
It was a really fine book, as all of her books are, but she interjected herself because she knew Bishop at Harvard. So that's one example of how to do that. I have not had to do that myself.
It can be dangerous. It can be a risk because reviewers will look at that and say, I came to, learn about the biographical subject, and what's this biographer going on about? And even if it's well done, you're nevertheless probably going to get at least some response, and I can live with that, and you probably should as a writer too. There probably will be some people who will object to that approach to biography.
Yeah, I put Megan's book in the chat too, because that one came to mind. I also am a huge fan of that book. I love it. But I know that some reviewers did not. And so it might be interesting if you're in that situation to look at what some of those reviews said, to kind of think through this process and look at how she did it. And maybe like Carl, you'll decide, I can live with that because I think this is important. I think it's a very successful book. So there are differing opinions about that one.
And years later, people are going to forget those reviews and are going to say, what a great book.
You're right, Carl. You're absolutely right.
Right.
That's happened with my biographies. They come out and they get mixed reviews, and then later people have very different views of them.
Right. And I'll just mention too, if you're not looking at the chat, you might take a peek in there. There are lots of good suggestions from many of you about other books that kind of touch on these themes or good examples of what we've been talking about. Anything else to add to that question?
I haven't had to deal with it, except that, of course, I've interviewed, my subjects have always been dead and I've never met them, in life. So, but I interview people that knew them, and it always comes up whether I should use first person when I describe meeting a person or try to write it some other way. I've noticed more and more people are using first person in biographies. In other words, the biographer is referring to herself or himself as I within the book. And I'm starting to get used to it. At first, I thought it seemed kind of intrusive, but I don't know. It seems less formal and kind of nice.
Yeah, I'm intrigued by it as well. The kind of idea of maybe a hybrid memoir biography would be really interesting. I wanted to mention, if you have questions about interviewing, we won't discuss that today. I know somebody sent in a question about it, and I referred him to the video that we did at the panel discussion about writing about living subjects. And so that, if you're writing about someone who is still alive, you might be interested in that one. That video is only available to members of Bio. Most of these videos that we're doing are available to anyone, but that one is behind our, in our membership area. If you go on the Bio website and go into the members area, because some of those biographies are still in progress, and the speakers asked that it be kept for just Bio members. So you might refer to that. So we have another question about what to do when you're missing some important material.
And
Oh, sure.
mm-hmm.
Yes,
I was just going to jump in because something occurred to me. Really talking maybe about two different kinds of books. Maybe this is stating the obvious, but I was thinking of Rebecca Mead's book on George Eliot. I mean, that's where it was completely personal. She's putting herself into the narrative. It's not really a biography. It's really a personal confrontation and experience of, in this case, an author. So that's a squidgy kind of area, and to Carol's point about do we use I? Obviously, Rebecca Mead did, but we have to be really careful about our objectivity and the credibility of the book. So I just throw that out there. Thank you.
Yeah, I thought of that one too, because that's another favorite one of mine. I think of it as a book about a book because it was, the focus of it was on Middlemarch, but you're right, it had a lot of biographical stuff too about Gertrude, about George Eliot. Okay, so the next question is about what to do when you don't have, important materials, like there's no autobiography, there's no memoir writing, little written about them by other people. What if not much is known about a particular stage in the subject's life, like childhood, for example? So how do you deal with those kind of gaps? Do you want to take that one, Carol?
Sure. I think for me, what has worked in those situations is just to keep doing more research, do broader research on the person's connections and their world, and you will probably turn up someone else who had similar experiences that can help you establish a cultural context for that time period. You do have to be careful. You don't want to speculate or make things up, but and then of course, just good writing, keep your narrative going, and don't dwell on that black hole. If it's childhood, I think that's what the question had asked about. I had a few examples with my book about Alice Adams, a novelist. I wanted to know more about her mother's youth because her mother was a difficult figure in her life, and I was trying to figure out what kind of a young woman her mother had been and what influence that had on her. And I eventually got connected with the alumni organization of her women's college and discovered that Pearl Buck had been a student there. And of course, Pearl Buck wrote lots of things about her own life. So, it was just kind of rooting around in the, in the area where I wanted to know more. And it eventually led me right back to other things, including things that her mother had written in college and published in the college literary magazine and so forth. Yeah, so that's one way. The question, as I saw it when it came in, was about why, what if your subject hasn't written anything or there isn't much written about them? So I guess the other thing is to look beyond writing, look at photographs, look at, as I said, alumni organizations, go to the place, try to meet people in the place where the person grew up and try to find out what it was like. Oh, historical newspapers are wonderful and actually pretty easy to find online now. I mean, I read skimmed 5 or 6 years of Yakima, Washington newspapers for my Carver book. And that gave me a great sense of the world he was growing up in.
Can I just throw in, you mentioned photographs, Carol, and it reminded me of Natalie Dykstra's biography of Clover Adams. So Clover Adams, wife of Henry Adams, not a lot of material. And what she discovered, though, Natalie did when she was writing the biography, that was that Clover expressed herself in her photographs. And so she used the photographs as sort of a way into understanding who Clover was. Yeah, and that was, and in my particular case, writing about a woman writer, Constance Fenimore Wilson, who, no diaries, there aren't a lot of letters, no autobiography or anything like that. I found her in her fiction. That was where I saw her being, expressing herself of who she really was. And so you might have to get a little bit creative about where you look for the person beyond autobiographical writing. That's a really good point. Kate and Carl, did you want to add anything to that question?
Yeah, a couple instances where there were gaps, even where, the subject is well known and even the subject is a writer or a public figure in some way. In my biography of Joe Craigie, for example, there was a 3-year gap between the ages of 18 and 21, where I had absolutely no information about, and it was an important period. It's when she first comes to London and tries to establish herself as a journalist. And I was really stuck. And I wrote to the novelist Francis King, English novelist, and I said, "Can you tell me, suggest a novel about London in the early 1930s from the point of view or about a young woman who's coming to the city?" And he said, "Elizabeth Bowen, Death of the Heart." And it just opened up a sense of what the city would have looked like to Jill Craigie. She said very tight-lipped that she had had a rough time going to the city. And King was saying, well, here's a novel will tell you why it would have been so rough for a young woman. I mean, you couldn't walk down the street without some man putting his hands on you. Jill Craigie did say that, which gave you some idea of what her life was like. There was that. And then when I was doing Martha Gellhorn's biography, she was alive. Her last husband, T.S. Matthews, was alive. Neither of them would talk to me. In fact, Matthews sent me a letter quoting Shakespeare, hence horrible shadow, hence. And I was really stuck. What should I do? Well, he had written a memoir. At this point, I knew a lot about her. I had an imagination. If I were writing a short story, I knew how I would write about the marriage. So you know what I did? I wrote, in a sense, a short story before I had my evidence. In the meantime, I was doing what Carol says to do: keep researching, keep looking. Because sometimes what you write will help you define or focus your search. And I was also writing the Hemingway biographers. I wrote to Kenneth Lynn, for example, and he said, well, Martha Gellhorn knew Bernard Berenson, and they probably corresponded. She was a big writer of letters, and so was he. Well, eventually what happened is I got to Itati, and there was that correspondence between Gellhorn and Berenson, in which she talked in extensive detail about her third marriage, which I was able to put together with some people that I interviewed who knew T.S. Matthews when he was editor of Time. So you just never know. So sometimes I tell people, it's not that you're going to publish it this way, but there's nothing wrong with writing ahead of your evidence, because the evidence may eventually turn up.
I think a really good example is Stacy Schiff's biography of Cleopatra, which got mixed reviews as well, but she had very little material to work on. And of course, Edmund Morris's biography of Reagan, which became infamous, different strategies for dealing with a real absence of, well, Cleopatra absence of any kind, or very little material about her in general. I can't speak to that because there was tons of material on my subjects, but again, it's really helpful to examine books that had to deal with that issue and see how they did it, particularly someone like Stacy.
Carl just said something that reminded me when I was working on Carver's childhood. There was actually someone I was trying to get to help me, and we were emailing back and forth for a long time, and he was asking me questions. He was a brilliant writer himself. And I, at some point, sat down and wrote a fiction section about Carver's childhood that, of course, I could never have used in my book, but it taught me all kinds of things about why hunting was so important to him as a child, because I'm not a hunter, and trying to imagine that made me look for other things. Not so much new information, but new emphasis of how his childhood experience as a hunter influenced him as a writer. You know, it just gave me insights. And the writer I was trying to get to help me was so impressed with that then he decided to help me. So you never know how things will turn out. But no, that's not my book. You can't actually fictionalize, but it can really help you understand things sometimes.
Okay, I'm going to jump ahead to a question that I think is a good follow-up to what we're talking about here, because this is a question I can really relate to. So when you want to get inside your subject's head and heart, your sources only give external forms, right? So you're only getting, you know, what happened, or maybe they're writing formal letters, that sort of thing, and you want to get inside your subject, your character. This person says, I don't want to write a book that gets set aside by smart readers because it seems too imaginative. I understand there are qualifiers such as she may have wondered, and perhaps her anger rose up, but how many of those undermine the story or point to too much creative liberty? So, you know, how do we kind of get inside somebody without crossing that line into what somebody may think of as fiction? And this, I was gonna have, yeah, Kate, I was gonna have Kate take a stab first. What do you think?
Sure, I will. I was reminded of E.B. White's, book title, but The Eloquence of Facts. Facts themselves speak. What you can find out is eloquence, and you can read into them. You can extrapolate from facts so much about a topic. But I would say, in terms of again, you should state in your preface, if you have this problem, it's really helpful, and I have an example here, to state in your preface your challenge, this exact challenge of very little material, and a lack of sources, letters, journals, etc., that give insight into your subject, the subject's inner state of mind. And you don't want to lapse into psychobabble, so it's really, really difficult. It does get tiresome, especially in a commercial and popular biography when the author has too much speculation. This might have, maybe this did, it's likely that, it's unlikely this. An example I came up with it's not really a biography, but it's a book by a Stanford scholar, Gordon Chang, called Ghosts of Gold Mountain, about the railroad Chinese who helped build the western half of the Transcontinental Railroad. So this is lesser known subjects for sure, because the railroad Chinese had not been written about that much. But he states in his introduction, and he calls it an introduction, despite their critical role in American history, the railroad Chinese remain silent spikes to this day. No text generated by any Chinese railroad worker on the transcontinental line in Chinese or English has been found, whether in the US, China, or elsewhere. This presents a formidable challenge to the historian or biographer today. How does one give voice to the voiceless? How does one recover a sense of lived experience if there is nothing from the central actors themselves? And he's a Chinese American. This is one of his projects, is to find these people. Though difficult, he says, a recovery of the lost past is possible if imaginative effort to understand the rich and expansive historical materials that do exist. This gets to some previous questions. 19th century writers wrote extensively about the Chinese, and their observations can be read in ways that move the railroad Chinese from being objects for journalistic observation into the active center of the story. Years of dedicated research have also revealed substantial new documentation and sources in archives and libraries. Some of this rich material has simply been ignored as insignificant, which again gets to our previous topics, or bypassed as too challenging to use. And I thought that was a really cogent way of explaining to his readers. And then my brother, who read the book, said, well, there are too many qualifiers. And I said, that's a scholarly convention. If you don't know, you don't speculate. And he wasn't used to that. But I thought Chang's setting out the drawbacks and the challenges and the promise of this kind of subject was good.
Hey, that was so helpful. Can you type the title and the author in the chat for us?
Yeah, exactly. Ghost, yeah, I'll do that right now.
Thank
It's a very
you.
good book if you happen to be interested in railroad Chinese. I'm from California. I think Carol's out there as well. So that was what got me to read the book. It's very well done and a very good example of forgotten figures and reviving people who have no voice because they left no record. So.
Okay, thank you so much. Carl or Carol, do you want to add anything about how to get beyond the external stuff into your character's head and heart without fabricating?
Well, I dealt with this in one of my podcasts, Life and Biography. I was actually dealing with the issue of evidence, but in this case, it's the evidence of what is going on inside my subject's mind. How can I get at it? And it had to do with my Faulkner biography. In 1951, shortly after he won the Nobel Prize, he went to work in Hollywood for Howard Hawks. They had worked together many times, and Faulkner had spent over 20 years in Hollywood. So at this point, when you get into the second volume of my biography, you have accumulated an enormous amount of evidence about Faulkner's screenplays, how he wrote them, to some extent how he felt about them. And then when you get to this point in 1951, he says to Meta Carpenter, a woman who he was having a love affair with, He says, I have to work on this novel, The Left Hand of God, and adapt it as a film. And he says something to her about it doesn't look like very promising material for a film. A couple days later, he writes to another woman he was involved with, Joan Williams, and he says to her, fantastic place. He was in the Chateau Marmont, and he says, fantastic work. He can only be talking about The Left Hand of God, although he doesn't actually mention the title. It's a long story that I lay out in my podcast, so I'll try to keep it short here. The story is about a soldier of fortune who masquerades as a priest. He's a lapsed Catholic. He even says at one point, religion is for children. He's a soldier of fortune escaping from a Chinese warlord. He escapes and impersonates a priest, and he has to perform mass, confession, all the things that a priest does. And gradually he grows into this role until finally, this is a little shortcut here, he gets religion. These people depend on him, and he thinks of himself now as their priest. That's not the end of the story, but I'll just stop there. It just powerfully hit me as I was reading the screenplay that this was Faulkner's story, that this was a man who for most of his life thought of himself as a loner on the literary outskirts, even though writers thought a lot of him. He wasn't making a lot of money for Random House. He wasn't really well known by the populace in general. He becomes this world figure, and people look up to him, and writers are writing to him, and they're asking for his advice. And again, I'm making the story very short, but I suddenly realized something happens to Faulkner. And then when you read the screenplay, you see that there are words and lines that are coming out of his Nobel Prize speech. Now, I don't know what's going on inside Faulkner's head. And I never in that whole section of the book do I ever say he must have felt. I don't say perhaps. I don't say probably. I simply tell the story about how this script hit him at a moment in his life when he was capable of writing the full story. I'm not really conveying exactly how I do this in the book. You really have to look at it, but you can read through the whole thing and you won't find a perhaps or a maybe or anything like it in there. And yet I think you'll feel, unless I'm kidding myself, it's an illusion, I do in a sense get inside my biographical subject.
Sounds to me like you all are talking about not being creative in the writing, but being creative with your sources, right?
Yes.
So creative
Yeah.
part comes in the
And
research, actually.
that's a good phrase, Anne, because when I was 18 years old, I read R.G. Collingwood's book, The Idea of History. And one of the things he says is, and in the old days, you didn't call your sources sources, you call them your authorities. Nobody would use that word now because it sounds so prescriptive. It sounds like you're giving away something to somebody else. They're not just sources, they're authorities. But he uses that word. And then he says, ultimately, unless you're writing scissors and paste history where you're just patching things together and you're not using your imagination, he says, ultimately, the historian is his own authority. And that's sort of the point of my podcast. Ultimately, you are your own authority. It's what you make of those sources.
That's great. That's so helpful. We should probably move on to another question. Liz, did you want to add something, Carol?
No, Carl nailed that one.
Okay. And Kate too. I thought those were just really helpful, interesting answers. So this one is for Carol. When writing about a writer or artist who produced a lot of work, do you have any advice about how to approach the work and look for patterns over time? That's number 11 on there. I'm kind of skipping around a little bit.
Yeah, I've written 2 books about short story writers. So I guess what I need to say is that there's no system to it. You just need to know the work really, really well so that it becomes a part of you. You can accomplish that, first of all, through the passion that led you to want to write this book in the first place. This sounds curmudgeonly, but I don't think you should be writing a book about an artist or writer whose work you don't admire. You may not have to love it. You've got to be critical of it, but you have to think it's worth spending the time on, and then you have to put a lot of time into it. Certainly what I've done is read all the work again as I'm starting the project, and then keep referring to it and read it again as I'm beginning to write, so that my research on the life is also always in tandem with getting to know the work better. There are some tricks to it. With Raymond Carver's poems in particular, I had a hard time keeping track of them in my mind. I had less trouble with his short stories, I think, because I've always been more of a critic of fiction. I've taught a lot of fiction writing courses and fiction reading courses. But with his poems, I ended up having to make kind of an index of subjects in the poems, lines in the poems that were hard to find for me. So there, you can certainly try to index the work in a way that's helpful to you. And with Alice Adams, I had a different problem, which was she had produced an enormous amount of work, 11 novels, 15 books altogether. Some of them were better than others. Her short stories were what I cared about most. So I just kind of slotted the novels into the part of her life when she was writing that particular novel, and spent a lot of time making notes on it as I was writing that part of the book. But it's about immersion. And I think it would be the same with a visual artist. If you're really writing a biography of an artist, you're probably walking around with that person's work in your head all the time. At the same time, being very careful to keep the life and the work separate and in conversation with each other, but don't get confused about what's fiction and what's life. You kind of have to be a literary critic to write a work about a writer. But I think you have to be a critic without a theory. Your theory is learning about the life. You don't need to have a theory of literature. So that's what I would advise. Just get to know the work.
Okay, thank you, Carol. Carl, do you want to add anything since you've written about so many writers?
Well, yeah, you saturate yourself in the work, especially if you're dealing with a writer, and you're really looking carefully at those biographical details. Not in the way that biography is sometimes criticized, that you see something in life, the writer's life, and you say, oh, well, here it is in the work, as if there's some kind of direct correspondence between the two. I'll just give a very quick example. There's a biography of Faulkner, and the critic is talking about his novel, A Fable, and he's criticizing A Fable, and he's saying, oh, there's all this stuff about uniforms. What's the stuff about, military uniforms in there? And I was just amazed, because I went back, it suddenly triggered something in me. And I looked at how, even as a small boy, Faulkner was entranced with uniforms, with his mother hand tailoring his clothes. His letters are just full of sartorial detail. He tells his editor, Sax Cummins, at Random House to go buy a pair of shoes that he saw in a Fifth Avenue shop window. I mean, the whole business about uniforms and what they say about Faulkner. As a young man, he didn't look very distinguished. He was short. He was 5'5". He grew to look like a very distinguished person. But as a young man, he had trouble having women take an interest in him when he tried to date and so on. And the uniform became a way, he proudly strutted around in his World War I uniform. Years and years after the First World War, he wore his uniform at various parties and special events and so on. So it's, you know, it's no surprise, and it's important actually, the use of uniforms in a fable. But in a way, you can be a literary critic and it can entirely pass you by. You can criticize the novel and say, what's this with all uniforms? When if you're a biographer, you know exactly why there's uniforms in that novel.
It's also very Southern.
Yes, very Southern. Yeah, because you could, you know, your father could be a colonel, and just because your father was a colonel, then you were the young colonel.
Yeah, there you go.
You automatically were inducted, whether you wanted to be or not.
Mhm.
Okay, thank you, Carl. I'm going to throw a question at Kate here. This one from a journalist who's used to writing short form pieces. What strategies can you offer writers to maintain narrative continuity and flow over such a long work? Kate, do you want to take that?
Sure. Actually, that's what happened with the Burt Lancaster bio. It was a piece first in Film Comment, the film literary journal that comes out from the Film Society of Lincoln Center, and then it got turned into a book. What I did, and what I would counsel, at least I thought it worked, is you just read, or at least peruse really good biographies and see how they do it. I did that all the time. Look at how they take note of their structure, their pacing, the flow, and the approach. You're not going to copy any of this. You're going to write your own book. But you want to look at the best of the best and model yourself on that if you can. This is not a biography, but I just finished a book called Heart of the Game. It's a sports book that one of my brothers gave me about a young minor league player who was killed, was hit. He was at the time a first base coach, and the batter slammed a ball down the first base line and hit him in the neck, killed him instantly. The book was initially a piece in Sports Illustrated, and it was so well received. It's a really sad story, but anyway, it was then expanded into a book that's become a sports classic. And it's really what the author did. He had one really moving story about a young man in the minors who never quite made it to the majors, and everybody loved him, and he's killed instantly. The book is really about the minor leagues, about the whole culture of the minor leagues, about the young player who never quite gets a break, who has a wonderful wife and children, and just a good person. Maybe a little bit too detailed for him, but anyway, that's a good example to me of someone who took a really excellent story and then expanded it out into a narrative that is really excellent. I would look for similar journalism examples. There are many. I mean, I'm sure some of the people on the audience, et cetera, can think of. So often a book started out as a piece in a magazine or in the newspaper, and an enterprising agent saw it, and then it gets bought and it becomes a book. So you want to look at the original piece and then look at the book that came out of it. You're talking about, in general, expanding a story into a much bigger context. With Lancaster, it was this kid that grew up in East Harlem and goes and becomes a movie star and a huge producer. Anyway, I won't go into all that. He was one of the most important people in the transition of movies from the golden age of Hollywood to independent production. And it had that huge contribution been forgotten. So I had to go into the whole context, which was so much fun, you know, of 1920s New York, 1930s New York. He joined the circus. It had to expand it out to a great big context. Once you have your outline, it seems to me, if you've written a journalistic piece, you have the chronology, which several of us have spoken about. It's the pivots, the key pivots of a life. You then you can better see how to syncopate the individual, your subject, with that larger story into the narrative. You start with that chronology, which you had to research to write your piece, and then you can expand it into something bigger if it has a bigger import for all the reasons we've already discussed. But again, I would look to the best examples of people who've done that and copy.
Okay, thank you. Kate, this might be a quick one. Carl, if the manuscript draft is already over 100,000 words and not halfway done, is it best to edit for length immediately or see the first draft through and then go back and edit to ensure it's concise and compelling narrative? And also, what is the longest publishable word count for biography?
Well, I would keep going, first of all, before I do edit as I go along, but I wouldn't stop, say, halfway through a book and go to the beginning again and start to sort of second guess myself and edit. I would complete at least a whole draft before I did any editing. What's an acceptable word count for a biography depends very much on who you're dealing with. That is what the publisher wants. With my first Sylvia Plath biography, American Isis, I think the proposal said 90,000 words. I turned in 120,000. The editor said, I thought it was supposed to be 90,000 words. And I said, well, I found this and that, and, kinds of things you would expect a biographer to say. And he said, well, just take a look at it. So I think I cut it down from 120 to 110,000. You never said another word. So I wouldn't make too big a deal out of it. I don't know what the standard is now, 120,000 maybe for a trade book biography, not much more than that, unless you're Heather Clark writing about Sylvia Plath and it's and it's sort of, and it's aimed to be the end all and be all. And I'm reading her book. There's a good reason why it's so long. I'm not criticizing it for being long at all. Some biographies really need to be long, but the publishers have to know that. Just one quick thing. When I proposed my Faulkner biography, first proposal was 130,000 words. Second proposal was 200,000 words. University of Virginia eventually bought it. They said, can you do it for 180,000 words? It had something to do with the price point, how much the books were going to be. I got halfway through it and it was 200,000 words and I was only halfway done. I said to them, you'll probably want to throw away the contract because it's going to be 2 volumes and write, I project about 450,000 words. And I was fortunate. Not too many publishers will do that, but they said, when they looked at it, they said, yeah, no, it's got to be 2 volumes. And so they went with it. So you never know. I certainly didn't start out to do that, but I got away with it.
Well, I'll just add that I want this writer to know that they're not alone, because I did something similar with my first book, my first biography. When I sold it, I'd already written the whole thing and, a draft of it anyway. And of course I had to write a proposal. And based on the proposal, they said, okay, we'll take it, but we want 120,000 words. And I realized I'd written almost 250,000, right? So it's like twice as long. And I had to cut it in half. And so I think that's common, actually, especially as you're feeling your way with the form. But 120 would be a good benchmark, I think. What's that, Carol?
I had about the same experience with my Carver book. It was absolutely enormous. I think it printed out to something like 1,400 pages. I hope that included the footnotes, or the endnotes, but I'm not sure. I mean, it was something I tried not to think about. But eventually, the editor and I made it much shorter. Well, I had to do all the work, but he just kept telling me to make it shorter. And, it was a much better book. When I finally shipped the early versions and all my papers off to a library, I couldn't even remember what that early version was anymore. And at one time I thought it was so important that, there wasn't a precious word I could cut, but.
One more quick story. When I did my Dana Andrews biography, this is for the Hollywood Legends series that I actually edited. You think I would know better, but it was supposed to be about 100,000 words, and I turned in 150, and the press said, that's a little too long. And I said, well, I know what to do about it. That is, I know it has to be shorter, but I'm not quite sure how to do it. And they said, well, what do you suggest? I said, give it to my wife, because she won't let me get away with anything. So they gave it to my wife, Lisa, and she cut 25,000 words, no problem. And when I looked at what she did, I cut another 5. So it can be done.
Okay, here's a question about striking a balance between analysis and explanation and the narrative of the subject's life. In other words, how much context should you include, and do you run the risk of taking the focus off of your subject? Kate, why don't you take a stab at that one?
Yeah, well, I'm thinking in all this of my hard-nosed editor, Knopf, who had me cut from like, I don't know how many words in half, just like you, Anne. Cut. He says, I don't want a brick. So I cut. His little, remembered always, when the temptation when it is to fall in love with your research and to then put it all in there. And he had this great phrase, controlled tangents. In other words, you have a narrative arc. It's like this, from beginning to end. And you have to keep your eyes on that arc. Now, every so often, because you have to for context, but also to make the book more enjoyable to read, to take, and it's a little relentless if you're just staying on the arc. You'll come to a point where you have to take a little controlled tangent off the arc and come back. But you never take your eyes off your subject, ever, off that arc. And that's your control, that's your creative control, to decide how much are you going to go off and come back. And I found that really, really useful for striking that balance, is to keep that in mind. You have a certain momentum, a certain focus. That's what the reader's diversion is, little controlled. It's a tangent, but it's controlled, and it comes right back to the narrative arc. And that's how I found working. And also I was thinking of something else he said, given all these words of wisdom, which is maybe the last word, not the last word really, but he would always say, in terms of how do you find those sources, how do you fill in those black holes, he would say, think harder, you know, and that's really what we all have to do, is think harder, and you will see the truth and the depth. Just think, don't expect it just to come, you know, present itself to you. Anyway, but I think those controlled tangents, if people remember that, and to remember they have an arc that they need to stay on, and the subject is their subject, not all this other stuff. It helps them keep it to a certain minimum of words and a certain exciting momentum of narration.
Any other suggestions, Carol and Carl?
I would be careful about chronology. I use chronology as a biographer, but sometimes chronology can lead you into one thing after another, and it will increase the length of a book. Even in my 2-volume Faulkner, it could have been longer. I mean, Joseph Blattner wrote a 2-volume biography of Blattner. It must have been 1,000,000 words. Each volume was over 1,000 pages. Mine's about half that. And one of the things I did was sometimes I used flashbacks, sometimes I used flash forwards. Sometimes when the subject was his relationships with women, I treated those as continuous stories, even though they spread out over, you know, sometimes 3 or 4 years, or in one case, 20 years. So that I tried to keep the story going, the interest in the character, so to speak, in the story, rather than saying, oh, he wrote to so-and-so and saw so-and-so on such a date, and then he did this and then he did that. Some of that is inevitable in a biography, but I think there are also ways to really focus on character and violate chronology in some ways.
Great. Carol, do you want to add anything?
I was just thinking about tangents, that controlled tangents is a good phrase. Sometimes your tangent can, yeah, it's a way to break up the chronology and the, you know, this happened and that happened kind of narrative, but it's always got to be closely tied. But you can bring in things. I was just doing some revisions on my Alice Adams book, to think more about her slave-holding great-grandparents. And, you know, and a lot of things I've been reading just in the last year about Black lives and enslaved people allowed me to make that a little bit better section of the book than it had been. So, I mean, sometimes a tangent isn't a tangent. It's a way back into understanding your character and the historical context of that character.
Yeah,
Great.
it's kind of part of this idea of these biographies being an exercise in time travel too. I mean, these little tangents, thinking of Burt Lancaster, I mean, going into the Union settlement movement in New York, you know, this sort of thing was just fascinating. And you or the circus or whatever, you take a little time travel and you take the reader with you, which is the great joy of it, I think, for the reader and for the biographer.
Thank you, Kate. Thanks to all of you. Those were great answers. This is the last of the questions that were sent in, and I think it's a nice kind of segue into the next panel that we'll be doing on writing a proposal, doing promotion. But this is from somebody, you know, you're writing your first biography, it's taking you a few years, and they're uncertain when to start thinking about, you know, writing a proposal, placing it with a publisher, whether they need a contract in hand. Can you offer some advice about the timing of proposal submissions relative to manuscripts completion? Please consider academically employed authors like me in addition to professional writers. Carl, what advice would you have about that?
I think standard practice now, and the panel can correct me if I'm mistaken about this, but usually publishers want to see a proposal and a sample chapter. They want to see what you're actually going to do in the book, and not just what you promised to do. As far as when you do that, I think it's when you obviously feel you have some command of the subject and can, in your proposal, not only comment on that sample chapter and where you're headed, but where your sources are and how you got them, and you know, what's new or what's important, that kind of thing. There are some writers who write a whole book and then submit the book. I've never done that. I've always somewhere in the midst of the research project, the research might be 3 months, and I'm ready to write a proposal. In the case of Rebecca West, I took a whole year because it meant traveling to a Yale archive when I was living in Brooklyn, and I could only do it 1 day a week. And I just was persistent about doing that continuously for a year until I felt there was just no way it was going to be turned down because I had so much new material by then. So I think it's partly a question of timing and how you feel when you're when you're ready to really show this to somebody, and that of course varies from individual to individual.
You know, I was working with a writer recently who, you know, is kind of still in the early stages of writing, but she's done all of her research. And I was trying to get her to think about writing a proposal next, and she decided she didn't want to. She wanted to write the whole book since it was her first biography before she even considered, you know, proposing it and selling it. So, you know, I can certainly understand that approach too. Kate and Carol, do you want to add anything about when to start thinking about about selling your book?
I just think it really varies. I mean, if it's your first biography, you don't have a track record as a biographer, so it's going to be more difficult to sell unless you've really got a subject that the world is waiting for. If you're an academic, I think they mentioned academics, that I hope that means you have a salary and you can keep working on it. So I think it's always a good idea to have it farther along. With my second book, I was able to sell it to the same editor. So I don't know if that was really better. I mean, it was nice to get in advance and it got me going on the research and the travel more quickly than I would have been able to otherwise. But I think I had less time to really gestate what kind of a book it would be. And writing that proposal up front when I didn't really know enough yet, in a way, I think threw me off for a little while. So I'd say take as much time as you can afford to.
There's one other factor for this first time biographer, I think, and that is, especially if you're, it's not quite, the time pressure isn't so much with university presses usually, but especially for a trade house, once you put out that proposal, they're probably going to want that book in a couple of years. And so that's something to think about too. Am I going to get this book done And my second biography was of Lillian Hellman. And there was another biography coming out, and St. Martin's Press gave me a 12-month contract. And my agent said, can you do that? I said, well, I'm gonna find out, because my first biography had taken 6 years. So that's something else to think about, that, how long do you think it's going to take you? You may be wrong about how long it's going to take you to write the book, but especially if it's the trade market you have in mind, once you get them excited, you're going to have to deliver.
Another factor about having a contract is it will help you get people to talk to you if you need to interview people. There are people whose time is so valuable, at least to them, that they will not talk to you unless you have a contract. But of course, that only applies to where you have living people that knew your subject.
Anything else, Kate?
Yeah, I think the danger of writing at first is you can get too married to one way of telling the subject. You can get too married to your version of the subject, or if you're a first-time person, you really haven't done this before. And I would be dubious about putting that much time and effort into something when you don't have a contract. But also, as we'll get into in the next event, proposals are an art form. And they make you think harder and harder and harder. And if you've got to go to harder again. And so the proposal really tightens you up, and the sample chapter. Some proposals are very short. Mine usually were, but another friend had a 50-page proposal for a successful book with Farrar Straus. I think I don't know, it's really hard. It depends what level you're aiming for as well. Whether you do any writing beforehand other than a proposal. I just think that's too speculative for me, but that's just me. I wouldn't put forth that effort if I didn't have a contract.
I think that's a really excellent point, Kate. And I think it is a bit risky to write the whole book before you figure out how you're going to sell it, right? Because that's what a proposal is. You're selling the book. So I think keeping an eye on that while you're writing is important, whether or not you go ahead and start selling the book. But that is something that we will definitely talk about in the next panel that we do next month. Okay, so I'll get together with those people and we'll decide when we're going to have it, and we'll send out an email to bio members again, and you can send in your questions like you did this time. But I want to thank all of you, the panelists. You were awesome. You were really wonderful. So I was taking a lot of notes. This is really great. And Michael, thank you for hosting us, doing the hosting duties. And thanks to all of you who came. See you next time.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you, Anne. Thank you, Michael. And Carol and Carl.
Good to see everybody.
Yeah, good to see everybody.